What comes to mind when you hear the word Pentecost, or when you think of the Holy Spirit? The Holy Spirit is this elusive third member of the Trinity, and while with God, we have creation and our own lives as evidence, if you will, and with Jesus, we have this historical and theological record. With the Holy Spirit, we don't have anything really concrete to attach our understanding to. There are many different ways the Christian church through the ages has sought the Holy Spirit and expressed the Holy Spirit in worship and Christian practice. Some of these expressions are more dramatic, and Episcopalians generally, and I would say particularly here at Epiphany, tend to lean away from the dramatic and toward the more reasoned. For example, speaking in tongues, which is what it sounds like the disciples were doing in our reading from Acts, and also what some Christian communities do in our day, is something that we don't do here at Epiphany. In our day, when mental health issues are on the rise, it seems, when in so many areas of our lives, rational, intellectual, and well-reasoned thought is golden, these other expressions of Spirit-filled Christians are something we might find difficult to understand. I want to challenge our perceptions here. And I say our perceptions, not your perceptions, because it's something I struggle with as well. I struggle with what it means to be a Spirit-filled Christian, living this Spirit-filled life, but that does not necessarily reflect those more dramatic gifts of the Spirit that we associate, such as speaking in tongues or prophesying, miraculous healings, and so on. My starting point is always that the church is as diverse as the world around us. And while I may not understand the practices of other Christians, while it may not speak to me in the same way that our worship and our community life does, as long as those other practices don't involve hate, it's something that I can certainly respect. That being said, I still question how this works. How does one have an experience like the Azusa Street Revival, which was the birth of Pentecostalism? 2 years of speaking in tongues and miraculous healings, and, as one historian said, interracial mingling. How does one reconcile those dramatic and outward expressions of the Spirit with the experiences of the Spirit that we have here at Epiphany and in our own lives as Christians? The Holy Spirit is a wild and wonderful aspect of the Trinity, present with God at creation, hovering over the waters, leading the people of Israel, descending upon Jesus at his baptism, and eventually descending upon the disciples on this day of Pentecost, and upon us in our baptismal covenant. The Holy Spirit is not something that we can nail down and define. It's not something that we can control, but it is something that we can trust. The Holy Spirit is something we can breathe in deeply and let live in us so that we may live in God. I can't think of a single world religion or spiritual tradition that does not have some sort of theology of breath. At the heart of meditation, of prayer, is breath. Shifting our awareness from outside ourselves to the breath that's filling our lungs and our bodies, the rhythm of the inhale and the exhale, is immediately grounding and settling. It brings us back from the grief and loss of the past and out of the anxiety of an unknown future and into the present moment where God, the ground of all being, is found. Our breath is a way that we connect to God. The Greek word for Holy Spirit for spirit is pneuma. And you know this word from pneumonia, same root. The Hebrew word for spirit is ruach. Both pneuma and ruach are used interchangeably for the English words spirit, wind, and breath. One knows by the context of the sentence which is meant, spirit, wind, or breath. Pneuma and ruach are animating principles. The air we breathe is the ruach of God. The pneuma of God is what Jesus breathes on the disciples in that upper room, the day of Pentecost in John's Gospel. The pneuma of God is always accompanied by peace. This movement of oxygen is what ultimately fans a fire and gives it life. In pneuma, in ruach, in spirit, there is fire and passion and life. This fire is what hovered above the heads of the disciples on the day of Pentecost in our Acts reading. So consider for yourselves, where is your fire and passion and life? What does the ruach of God breathe into life in you? In Acts, this spirit, wind, breath inspired the disciples to speak in such a way that people who spoke different languages could understand. Every person heard the disciples speaking in their own native language. Acts does not tell us that the disciples suddenly acquired a new language, but that what they spoke, others were able to understand in the language that had been with them since the beginning of their lives, the language in which they live. Rather than the miracle being about the language that was spoken or the language that was heard, what I read as the true miracle of the Pentecost story is that the Spirit of God made it possible for the disciples to share their passion, their love of God and of the good news, in a way that others who had not yet experienced this could understand. The disciples were able to speak their own language, so to speak. And this is a true gift of the Spirit. On this day of Pentecost, the birthday of the church through the outpouring of the Spirit, I want you to remember two things. First and foremost, this Holy Spirit is alive in you, as close to you as your own breath. Drawing near to God through the Holy Spirit is as simple as taking a deep breath in and being aware of the present moment, of that breath going in and the breath coming out. Spirit is breath and life. Spirit is what animates us. And the second thing I want you to remember is that the Spirit in you has uniquely gifted you to speak someone else's language. We have all been given a gift to make the good news of Jesus and the perfect love of God for all creation known in wherever we find ourselves. This gift is in you just by your being, just being who you are. The Spirit is in you, breathing through you, and you share that breath, that spirit, that life with others. For us as Christians, it's always about receiving and giving, receiving and giving, breathing in the Spirit of God and breathing out the love of God for the world.